There are a lot of innocent factors that can end up making your sourdough bread dough look and feel extra sticky. The humidity in your environment, the brand of flour you're using, possibly even your elevation. These are all just a few potential culprits that are making your bread dough stickier. So if you found a recipe online and you're following it perfectly, but your bread dough still ends up stickier than what the recipe showed or the video showed online, don't freak out. Something probably happened and you can fix it. In this video, I'll give you 3 ways to immediately deal with a sticky sourdough bread dough, and at the end, I'll give you a few tips for how to make your bread dough easier to handle in the future. My name is Grant from grantbakes.com, and I want to help you make better sourdough bread without all the unnecessary steps. If that sounds good to you, check out my other videos. Tip number 1, if you followed your recipe perfectly and your dough still ends up feeling and looking extra sticky, stickier than the recipe you saw online, try using a little bit of water on your hands when you're handling the dough. One of the main ways we get rid of stickiness in bread dough is to develop the gluten in the dough. We can do this by having the dough rest for long periods of time, and we can also do this by kneading or doing stretch and folds or slap and folds with our hands. That's why if you put a little bit of water on your hands, get them a little bit damp, there's going to be a non-stick barrier created between your hands and the dough, making it a lot easier to handle. Right after you mix your dough is the stickiest it's ever going to be. The gluten hasn't been developed yet within the dough, so you shouldn't be surprised when it feels really sticky. A little bit of water on your hands will go a long way in making your dough feel less sticky in the beginning. You might even find that as you go through the stretch and fold process, 2, maybe 3 sets of stretch and folds, your dough starts to feel less sticky, and you can even comfortably start using less water on your fingers. Tip number 2. If your sourdough bread recipe calls for, say, 3 sets of stretch and folds, that's what my recipe calls for, but your dough is still too sticky at the end of the 3 sets, feel free to do extra stretch and folds. You can up it to 4 or 5 sets of stretch and folds. This will just increase the gluten development in the dough, hopefully making your dough less sticky, and it won't throw off the recipe in any noticeable way, in my opinion. So if you come to the end of the 3rd set of stretch and folds, it still feels a little bit too sticky for your comfort, give it an extra set of stretch and folds, rest for a half hour, and then another set of stretch and folds, and then start the bulk fermentation. Hopefully those 2 extra sets will give the dough more gluten development and take the edge off of that stickiness. Just know that if you are doing more stretch and folds, you're kind of prolonging that stretch and fold period, so your dough might end up rising faster during the bulk fermentation time. If your recipe calls for 6 hours of bulk fermentation, it might only take 5 for you since you've been going for a longer period of time anyway. So if you are changing up what the recipe calls for and what it tells you to do, you'll just have to adjust a little bit based on how your dough is looking and feeling. And my 3rd tip for working with sticky dough is to just add a little bit of extra flour to your dough or to the counter. I hesitate to give this advice because using flour to make your bread dough feel less sticky can really be used as a crutch if you overdo it. A lot of times we, especially as new bread bakers, will feel stickiness in the dough, so we'll add some flour. We'll feel stickiness, so we'll put flour on the counter and we'll put flour in the dough and kind of work it in. But the reality is that bread dough is supposed to be sticky, at least a little bit, when the bread dough hasn't fully developed a strong gluten network. So adding too much flour in the beginning stages can really just throw off your recipe and change the hydration levels and create something that's different than the recipe was intended to be. So you don't want to overdo the flour. But if you find that whatever recipe you made really just turned out way too sticky for you, the dough feels way wetter than you can handle, it really won't hurt to add 15 to 25 extra grams of flour to the dough, mix it in, and then see how the dough feels after that. It won't completely throw off the recipe or change too much, but it might take an edge off the stickiness. So don't be afraid to add an extra 15 to 25 grams of flour to a recipe that feels overly wet. It should help out a lot. So to deal with a sticky dough here and now, use a little bit of water on your hands to help with the stickiness, perform more stretch and folds than what the recipe asks for, and if you have to, use a little bit of flour on your hands, on the counter, or on the dough, but just not too much. Now I'm going to give you a few bonus tips. Bonus tip number 1, it's okay to switch to a different recipe. If the recipe you're following is constantly producing a bread or a dough that's way too sticky for you, just switch to a lower hydration recipe. A lot of times we try to make the high hydration open crumb sourdough bread recipe that we saw on Instagram, and then we end up making it and feeling really defeated because it didn't come out the way we wanted or the dough is way too sticky. I've definitely been there. It's okay to use a plain old beginner's sourdough bread recipe with a lower hydration. There's no shame in that at all. A good place to start is a 70% hydration sourdough bread recipe. 70% or lower, in my opinion, is a great place to start. My master sourdough bread recipe is exactly 70% hydration. I'll include a link to it in the video description down below. Feel free to follow that recipe. I think it's a great one, but any recipe you find out there that's about 70% hydration, that should be a great place to start too. Bonus tip number 2. Reduce the amount of water in your recipe. If you have a recipe that you really want to follow, or it's a recipe you really like, but it just makes too sticky of a dough, feel free to reduce the water amount. Just like it's okay to switch recipes, it's okay to change a recipe and use less water. I recommend starting by reducing the water amount by 15 to 25 grams and just mix the dough together with that water set off to the side. When you mix the dough with less water, it should feel a lot less sticky. If the dough feels too dry, you can always add that water in, squeeze it into the dough. But with the reduced water amount, the dough will probably come out a lot better for you and a lot easier to handle. So feel free to play around with the water amounts in specific recipes that you find online or in cookbooks, and basically adjust the water amount to suit your needs. Bonus tip number 3, use a scale, a digital scale or any kind of scale where you can weigh your ingredients. Bonus tip number 4 is to change the flour that you're using. Flour is one of those ingredients that can make kind of a minor difference. So if you're finding that you're using a certain brand of flour and it's consistently giving you sloppy, wet doughs, no matter what recipe you're following, change to a different flour. I recommend King Arthur brand bread flour or Bob's Red Mill brand bread flour in the United States. These flours are both around 12 to 13% protein, and having a protein percentage at about that level seems to be ideal for baking bread. In general, this level of protein in the dough will lead to better gluten development and a less sticky dough. I hope this video was helpful. Just a few tips for dealing with a sticky dough and how to change up your recipe if you find that it's a little bit too sticky for you in the moment. If you're new to this channel, I'd love to have you back. You can check out another video of mine right here.